WHONET Training Course Module 5, Data Analysis and Interpretation. In Module 4, we saw the mechanics of how to run an analysis in WHONET, but we did not discuss very much the interpretation of results. Here in Module 5, we will discuss each of the analyses in turn and the value that they provide to the data analyst. We'll start with some guiding principles for interpretation and then go through each of the WHONET analyses. The two primary focus areas that we always keep in mind when we interpret data are interpretations from the epidemiological perspective and from a continuous quality improvement perspective. In the area of epidemiology, we like to utilize the data to track and understand emerging threats to guide policies, practices, and interventions over time. We also realize that the analysis needs are different between local, national, regional, and global levels. We can also utilize the data to help assess the quality of data. We can improve the utilization of laboratory services through an assessment of diagnostic stewardship, the timely collection of relevant specimens. We want to improve the reliability and value of laboratory services to ensure that the test practices are appropriate, the test results are not unexpected, and that test reporting to clinicians is appropriate. The impact of bias on results. Routine laboratory data intrinsically have a number of biases, and there are two primary consequences of bias in laboratory-based studies of antimicrobial resistance. Typically, we underestimate disease burden because often there are no specimens collected from the majority of patients who have disease. On the other hand, we often have an overestimation of resistance rates. Specimens are often collected in patients with treatment failures, with complicated medical histories, with long hospital stays. There are no simple or inexpensive strategies to avoid bias. Well-designed protocols can help to minimize bias, and these are worthwhile. However, they are often resource-intensive, time-limited, and focus on a few priority conditions in a few clinical sites. Therefore, we do need to keep in mind that the data that we view from the laboratory often have these biases. For certain surveillance objectives, the impact of biases can be devastating to appropriate quality policy decisions, while for other objectives, the impact of biases is less. With regard to high-impact consequences, treatment guidelines, disease burden estimates do suffer significantly when the data are severely biased. On the other hand, with regard to medium impact, for advocacy and awareness, the data can still have the important message that resistance is bad, it is getting worse, and the problems are diverse, even if the data are not 100% reliable. On the other hand, there are some other areas where the impact of biases is less, in the detection of outbreaks, in monitoring baseline trends, in the recognition and confirming of new resistance, and the continuous quality improvement in laboratory services. So we do need to keep in mind that the data that we receive do reflect the testing done by the laboratory, but that does not represent testing often out in the general community. We'll now go through each of the WHONET analyses to discuss the value and the interpretation of the results, starting with percent resistant, intermediate, susceptible, and test measurements. Here on the left, you see the analysis screen that we saw in module number 4. When I click on analysis type, on the right, I see the 6 kinds of analyses that WHONET offers. And for this first analysis, I will focus on number 2, the percent RIS and test measurements. Here we see that screen in greater detail. We see that there are 2 report formats. Number 1, a detailed report, often very valuable for the microbiologist, and 2, a summary report, which is more useful for the pharmacy and national authorities and other colleagues. The first report is called the detailed report. There will be 1 table for each organism and 1 antibiotic test on each row. You will see the antibiotic breakpoints, the RIS statistics, and 95% confidence intervals. You will also see histogram graphs for the disk diffusion and MIC results, and this information is useful for detailed data evaluation. On the other hand, the summary or antibiogram presentation is often more valuable for healthcare colleagues and pharmacists and national authorities. There will be one row for each organism, one column for each antibiotic. You can choose between %R, I, or S, or combinations of these variables. As high-level summaries, the percent susceptible is especially useful for the development of treatment guidelines, while microbiologists and epidemiologists often prefer a focus on percent resistance for purposes of resistance monitoring. This is an example of the RIS and test measurements output in the detailed report. It is a slide for Staphylococcus aureus. At the top of the screen, I see there are 76 isolates. I see the breakpoints, the percent RIS, and at the bottom left, I see graphs. This particular graph is the graph of the number tested for each antibiotic. This graph has two significant values. First of all, what drugs is the laboratory testing? Are they appropriate? Do they have breakpoints? Or are there certain drugs that should not be tested? So there's one value of this analysis. Another value of this graph is to look at how regular test practices are. In this example, I see that all of the antibiotics are always tested with the exception of nitrofurantoin, which is a urine antibiotic, and therefore this laboratory is doing selective testing, and they are only testing nitrofurantoin on the urine drugs, on the urine samples. Here are 4 examples of what the zone diameter distribution would look like. The 2 graphs on the left illustrate the zone diameter distribution for ampicillin. In the top left, we see the samples analyzed using the human clinical breakpoints. And in the bottom left, we see the results using the cat breakpoints for uncomplicated urinary tract infections. The 2 graphs agree on the susceptible breakpoint, but they do have different values for the resistant breakpoint. In the lower right, we see trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. We see 2 distributions. We see 2 distributions in the susceptible area. We see some bacteria that are very susceptible with large zone diameters that are probably susceptible to both trimethoprim and sulfamethoxazole with synergistic killing. On the other hand, we see another population between 16 and 21 with moderate susceptibility. These isolates are probably resistant to one of the 2 drugs, but susceptible to the other. As long as it is susceptible to one of the 2 drugs, it is susceptible to the combination. So you can see how the zone diameter can help us to understand something about the mechanisms of resistance. We now move on to this percent susceptible summary presentation, also known as the antibiogram. In this example, we see 3 gram-negative species, Escherichia coli, Klebsiella pneumonia, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa. We do not see all of the details that we had in the previous presentation, percent RIS, breakpoints, zone diameters. We do not see that here. We do see the percent susceptible on the left, and the number tested is further off to the right. This information is valuable to the pharmacists and clinicians as they decide on a day-to-day basis what antibiotics should be utilized for empiric therapy decisions. There is also a graph here. It demonstrates the percent susceptible among Escherichia coli to many antibiotics, showing that in this particular database, most of the isolates are relatively susceptible. So what are some of the uses of these analyses, percent RI and S? From an epidemiological perspective, we can monitor resistance trends and track high-priority resistance, such as CRE and MRSA. We can use the statistics to develop treatment guidelines, support antimicrobial stewardship programs, and assess stewardship interventions. At the national level, we can benchmark across facilities. to look at areas with high resistance and other areas with low resistance. The analysis also has value for quality assessment. We can look at the appropriateness of test practices. Are they testing antibiotics that do not have published breakpoints? Are there certain antibiotics that they should be testing? Do they have evidence of irregular test practices such as stock outages? Are there unexpected findings that may suggest testing errors? If you find Klebsiella pneumonia 20% susceptible to ampicillin, that would suggest a mistake. This organism is typically ampicillin resistant. So if you find 20% susceptible to ampicillin, I would suspect that the organisms are not Klebsiella pneumonia, or they are not susceptible. So one should consider retesting these isolates. Or if you find Escherichia coli 80% susceptible to gentamicin, but only 50% susceptible to amikacin, again, that suggests some kind of mistake or bias. Amikacin is typically more susceptible than gentamicin. What is the value of the test measurements, such as the disk diffusion measurements or the MIC values? From the perspective of epidemiology, we can recognize distinct phenotypic subpopulations with high-level resistance, moderate resistance, borderline susceptible, or highly susceptible. Using these measurements, we can also reanalyze the data using human or animal clinical breakpoints or epidemiological cutoff values. So we have a lot of flexibility at the time of analysis. We can also reanalyze older data using the newer breakpoints. From the perspective of quality assessment, does the laboratory measure? And we recommend, yes, please measure to ensure that the results to clinicians are accurate. We can look at the susceptible population. Do the results suggest good quality testing? When you have good quality testing, typically the susceptible bacteria will have a relatively smooth and symmetric distribution. If you do not see this, you might have deficiencies in the medium, in the discs, or in the inoculum that you may want to check through quality control testing. Is there a significant preference for certain numbers, such as even numbers or multiples of 5? This analysis, %RIS, does have a number of other options. I will mention briefly the options in green right now, and I will talk about the option in blue on the next slide. In green, you have the choice between analysis of all antibiotics or certain antibiotics of greater interest to you. You can choose the percentage of isolates, the %RIS, or the number RIS. Typically, zone diameter distributions end at 35 millimeters, but for certain organisms like Neisseria gonorrhea or Bordetella pertussis, the zone diameters can be very large, so you might want to change the range up to 70 or 80 millimeters. You can also do the same for the MIC ranges. On the histograms earlier, you saw the red breakpoints. But the red lines, instead of representing the breakpoints, they could represent the quality control range. So those are some simple options that are of value. In blue, you see the ability to stratify data according to different variables. And we will see that on the next slide. Previously, we saw the statistics separately for each antibiotic. Now we see the distribution for each antibiotic and each location type. In the table, you see 5 rows for penicillin, corresponding to penicillin statistics for inpatients, outpatients, emergency, intensive care unit isolates. This kind of ability to stratify is present in most of the WHONET analyses and is very valuable if you want to compare different years, different animals, different specimen types. In this example, I have chosen location type. The graph that I have selected is specifically for cefoxitin among outpatients. So this is MRSA. On the left, we have highly resistant strains, and the MSSA, the methicillin susceptible strains, on the right. So this is stratification of the RIS analysis by location type. On the next screen, we can see stratification of the summary analysis, the antibiogram, according to human, animal, or food origin. I see 3 rows in the table. The first row is for animal results, the second row is for food results, and the third row is for human results. I see that same information in the graphs. I see ciprofloxacin 3 times. The 2 graphs on the left represent animals and food statistics, and the statistics are similar. But among human isolates, the susceptibility of ciprofloxacin is higher in the human population. Moving on now to the next analysis, which is isolate listing and summary. We see there are 2 output formats, listing and summary, and we will discuss both of those. In the listing, you will see a list of all isolates that meet the selection criteria. 1 row is equal to 1 isolate. The table will include information like patient name, date of birth, animal species, location, specimen date, specimen type, organism, and the antibiotic results. In the summary, you can choose a variable for the rows, such as organisms, and a variable for the columns, such as specimen date by month. Other examples include organism by specimen type or state and farm number by animal species. So you have a lot of ability to stratify the data in the ways that are most interesting for you. The table will include information like the number of patients, the number of isolates, and the number of patients by month. This is an example of an isolate listing. 1 row equals 1 isolate. I see columns for identification number, location, specimen number, specimen date, specimen type, and the microbial species, followed by all of the antibiotic results. And in this case, you see the disc diffusion zone diameter measurements. This is a summary of that list. It tells you how many. For example, on the second row, I see Escherichia coli. There were 86 isolates from 71 different people. And then I see the distribution by day. I'm only analyzing 1 month of data today in this course, in this module, so I can see the statistics by day. I see that information in the graph. Escherichia coli is a common organism. There are Escherichia coli almost every day. So what is the value of these 2 analyses, the listing and the summary? The listing is valuable for generating a list of priority results for review and action by healthcare workers, laboratory staff, and disease control authorities. For example, a list of CRE, a list of positive blood cultures from the nursery, a list of salmonella out in the community. From a quality perspective, the analysis can help us to identify incorrect or unlikely results. For example, there might be a typing mistake in some of the dates, or in the gender, or in the antibiotic results, and you can see these results in the listing. The summary also has value for epidemiology. We can summarize the workload, how many patients, how many isolates, how many samples. We can describe the human and animal population studied, summarize the sample locations, the sample types, and the microbiological results. From a quality perspective, we can also identify mistakes such as missing time periods or incorrect values. I will now mention some of the options in green, and then the options in blue will be discussed on the next slides. In the top right, again, we can choose the stratification variables. I can choose organisms or location or specimen type or animal species or laboratory name. I can choose the specimen date by day or week or month or quarter, so you can choose how the data should be stratified. In the lower left, I have the choice between presenting the test measurements or MIC values or the test interpretations. In the lower right, I can choose between having a summary of the number of patients, which is more meaningful epidemiologically, or the number of isolates, which tells you more about the laboratory workload. I will now mention the 2 blue options. On the left, you see the option to include isolate alerts or include microbiology alerts. And in the right, include cluster alerts for finding possible outbreaks. So here you see the results of the isolate alerts. You see the same isolate listing we saw a few slides ago, but some of the antibiotic results have been highlighted in red. These are important or unusual or unlikely. If I scroll further over to the right of the listing, I will see the description of why the box appears in red. Here I see the description. I see 3 columns off to the right labeled Quality Control Alert, Important Species Alert, and Important Resistance Alert. I can see the description of the alert. For example, I see high priority alert, Enterobacteriaceae, carbapenems non-susceptible. There are also some quality control alerts about discordant results. For example, if you have Staphylococcus aureus, penicillin susceptible, oxacillin resistant, that doesn't make sense. That is not microbiologically plausible. So WHONET has high priority, medium priority, and low priority alerts, categorized as quality control, important species, and important resistance. And here we see them in the listing. We now move on to the cluster alerts in the summary. The cluster alerts are an option with WHONET to find possible outbreaks where there are more people or more isolates than you would normally expect. In the table, we see 2 examples, one of them for Klebsiella pneumonia in the lower right, and one of them for Corynebacterium species in the lower left. In the lower left, I do not think that this represents an outbreak. We have 8 patients with diphtheroids on January 25th. But this organism is not very pathogenic. It does not often cause severe disease. It does not often cause outbreaks, but it does frequently cause contaminations. So my guess is that the graph on the left perhaps represents an issue of contamination of clinical samples or contamination of laboratory reagents. That is an important issue. It's not a disease issue, but it's a quality issue. In the lower right, this looks more like a possible outbreak. There were 2 people, and then 3 people, and then 5 people. I would like to know, are these inpatients or outpatients? What is the specimen type? What are the resistance characteristics? So in the lower right, I might want to investigate this further as a possible outbreak. These red alerts are generated through the integration of WHONET with a free software called StatScan, which means space and time scan analysis. So WHONET and StatScan apply advanced algorithms to look for possible outbreaks that you see here highlighted in red. We will now move on to the next analysis, which is a scatter plot. As you can see, there are 2 formats. You can have a scatter plot with test measurements like MIC or zone diameter measurements, or with test interpretations, that would be the RIS categories. And you choose 2 antibiotics that you would like to compare. So in a scatter plot, we compare the results of 2 antibiotic susceptibility tests. The antibiotics may be within the same class of drugs, for example, ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin, or in different drug classes, for example, ciprofloxacin and gentamicin. You can also compare 2 different test methods, for example, the imipenem disc with the imipenem E test. There are 2 output formats. You can do a scatter plot using the zone or the MIC measurements, or you can do a scatter plot with interpretations using the RIS categories. The measurements is more valuable for the infection control team that would like to see a lot of detail. The scatter plot with interpretations is more useful for the pharmacy when they want to look at cross-resistance. So here on the left, we see an example of a scatter plot with RIS categories. We see the first column have bacteria that are Staphylococcus aureus that are resistant to cefoxitin. So that first column represents the MRSA result. The final column represents cefoxitin susceptible. Those would be MSSA, methicillin susceptible Staphylococcus aureus. In the top right, I see that 46.5% of the isolates are sensitive to both of these drugs. In the lower left, I see that approximately 12% are resistant to both of the drugs, and these are the MRSA. Of note, if I look at the first column, I see all of the cefoxitin-resistant results, the MRSA, and I see that none of them are erythromycin susceptible. And that's something special for this particular laboratory. In this particular laboratory, all of the MRSA are resistant to erythromycin, and that must be due to some linkage through plasmids or chromosomes of the resistance genes. This kind of information is useful to the pharmacy as they are looking at possible first-line drugs, second-line drugs, various treatment alternatives. In the right graph, I see the exact same isolates, but now with the zone measurements. And I can see various groups. Group A in the upper right has large zone diameters for the two drugs, so is susceptible to the two agents, or intermediate. In the lower left, Group B is resistant to both drugs, and those are the MRSA. Group C and Group D do share something. Both Group C and Group D are susceptible to cefoxitin, but resistant to erythromycin. However, Group C is very resistant to erythromycin, and Group D is moderately resistant to erythromycin. And this can be useful to the infection control team as they are looking for possible outbreaks and transmissions. I do not have the molecular typing information available, but with the phenotype, Group C and Group D look to be different bacteria and different clones. This is another example of a scatter plot from a pharmacy perspective. It is a scatter plot showing Klebsiella pneumonia and a comparison of the two aminoglycosides, gentamicin and amikacin. In the graph in the top right, we see that approximately 86% of the bacteria are susceptible to both drugs. Therefore, both drugs are relatively good. In the lower left, 0.3% are resistant to both drugs. In the top left, I see 10%. These 10% are resistant to gentamicin, but they do maintain their susceptibility to amikacin. So amikacin is indeed more effective. In 10% of the cases, the gentamicin is resistant, but the amikacin is susceptible. So I can make two observations. Both gentamicin and amikacin are effective for most people. However, amikacin is more effective, approximately 10%. I could take these observations and come to an incorrect conclusion. The incorrect conclusion is that amikacin is better, therefore I should give amikacin to all of my patients when I would like to use an aminoglycoside. But that is not the best conclusion because amikacin is a more expensive drug and it's a reserve agent that we want to save for the patients with the worst disease. So a better conclusion from this graph is that gentamicin works well in most patients. So gentamicin is less expensive, and it is an appropriate first-line agent for patients with simple community infections where there is not an immediate risk of life and death. And the patient could return, if the patient is not improving, to get a different antibiotic. On the other hand, amikacin is a more expensive reserve agent, but its use is justified in patients with severe disease, such as sepsis, where there may be a high risk of mortality. So what is the value of the scatter plot? From the perspective of epidemiology, it can provide insights into the mechanisms of resistance, especially if the antibiotics are from the same class. It can also provide insights into the linkage of resistance genes, especially if the antibiotics are from different classes, and the genes might be on chromosomes, they might be on plasmids. The scatter plot is also useful to the pharmacy in the determination of first and second line treatment alternatives. From a quality perspective, we can also look for unusual results. If I find an Escherichia coli susceptible to ampicillin but resistant to imipenem, the most common reason for that is a mistake, perhaps a bad imipenem disc. Or if I find Escherichia coli susceptible to gentamicin but resistant to amikacin, that is possible, but in most countries it is not common. So if I see an infrequent result like that, I might want to retest it before I report the result to a clinician. Also, the scatter plot is valuable for confirming important results. For example, do the imipenem disc and the imipenem MIC give comparable interpretations? The scatter plot does offer a few other options. I can do percent of isolates or number of isolates. When resistance is rare, sometimes the number of isolates is easier to interpret, but most of the time we use the percentage of isolates. You can also draw a regression line, especially for similar antibiotics like cefotaxime and ceftriaxone. We can now move on to resistance profiles. Resistance profiles is one of the most valuable analyses in WHONET, but many people do not understand its value, and I hope we can address that in today's module. Resistance profiles offers two report formats, a listing and a summary, and we will see both. In the listing, one row equals one isolate. You will see a column called resistance profile, and this column will tell you the antibiotics to which the organism is non-susceptible or non-resistant, depending on your choice. For example, if you see ampicillin, imipenem, ciprofloxacin, and gentamicin, that means that the isolate is not susceptible to these four drugs, but it is susceptible to the other antibiotics that you have selected for this analysis. These are the resistance profile antibiotics that you can select in laboratory configuration in the antibiotic area. You will also see columns for MDR, XDR, and PDR. MDR is multi-drug resistant, XDR is extensively drug resistant, and PDR is pan-drug resistant. And this utilizes definitions from the European Center for Disease Control, the European Center for Disease Prevention and Control, or the ECDC. In the summary of the listing, you will see each profile in a new row and columns for the number of patients and the number of isolates. You can also choose to see the number of patients by month, by animal species, by location, or other variables. This is an example of the listing. In the first green box, I see the resistance profiles. At the top, I see several isolates that are non-susceptible to two drugs, penicillin and erythromycin. And then I see isolates resistant to 3 drugs and 4 drugs and 5 drugs. On the last 3 rows here, you see isolates that are resistant to all 7 drugs that I have requested. So this raises a few points. One is that not all Staphylococcus aureus are the same. Some are relatively susceptible, some are moderately resistant, and some are very resistant. We do not have the genotypic information, but we do have the phenotype. And these phenotypes are very valuable for outbreak detection. I can also see there are several rows here with FOX, that's cefoxitin. So every row here with FOX is an MRSA, and not all MRSA are the same. Some MRSA are relatively susceptible, some are MRSA are relatively resistant. So we can use the phenotype as a proxy, as a substitute for the genotype, and it's useful for cluster detection. You then see columns for multi-drug resistant, MDR, XDR, and PDR. You see an example where it says possible PDR. Possible PDR means that the isolate is resistant to everything that you tested, but we do not know if it is resistant to everything in the ECDC list. The ECDC list is a very long list that includes daptomycin, linezolid, and ceftobiprole. So to be PDR, you need to test all of those drugs, and it has to be resistant to all of them. If it's resistant to everything that was tested locally, we say possible PDR. This is a summary of the resistance profiles. There is a resistance profile in each row. I see the first row is resistant to 2 antibiotics, and then resistant to 3, resistant to 4. The last row appearing in blue is resistant to all 7 antibiotics. And that's what we see in the graph. 1 isolate at the beginning of the month, 1 isolate at the end of the month, and 2 isolates in the middle of the month. In this example, it does not look like an outbreak, but there are other examples where it might suggest an outbreak based on the phenotype. So what is the value of resistance profiles? From the perspective of epidemiology, multi-drug resistance profiles assist in the characterization of possible resistance mechanisms, especially when you compare antibiotics from the same class, such as several beta-lactams, or several quinolones, or several aminoglycosides. Multi-drug resistance profiles also assist in the phenotypic tracking of emerging populations. This could include the detection and confirmation of new phenotypic clones that you have not seen previously. It can also include the detection, investigation, and containment of possible community or hospital outbreaks based on their phenotype. If necessary, you can also do molecular typing to confirm the clonality. Multi-drug resistance is also valuable to the pharmacy in the evaluation of therapy alternatives. In a scatter plot, we discussed this with regard to 2 antibiotics, but here we can extend this to many antibiotics. The resistance profile analysis is also valuable for quality assessment, especially if you find phenotypes that are impossible or rare. For example, if you find an Escherichia coli resistant to ceftriaxone and imipenem, but susceptible to ampicillin, that is unlikely, and it suggests some mistake in the laboratory test results. Resistance profiles has many other options. I will mention briefly the options in green. In the top right, again, you can choose the stratification variables. In the left, you can define and review and change which antibiotics you want to define for defining your multi-drug resistance patterns. You can choose whether the intermediates should be grouped with the resistant or the susceptible isolates. In the lower left, you do have an option to omit isolates that were only partially tested. For example, you might have 1 E. coli tested against 8 drugs and a different E. coli tested against 7 drugs. So what you can do is you can eliminate isolates that were not completely tested. On the good side, this cleans up the analysis. You get analyses where everything is completely tested, and that's good. On the other hand, you are losing isolates that are not completely tested. So you do want to balance that by having a clean analysis, but without losing too many. Of course, the best solution is to always test the important drugs for analysis here. In the middle, we see an option of choosing between the display of the test measurements or the test interpretations. In the lower right, I can make my summary using the number of patients, which is more meaningful epidemiologically, or the number of isolates, which is more meaningful for laboratory workload. I will now discuss the next option called Include Cluster Alerts. If I click on that option, I can proceed to the next slide. And here we see an example in red. In the table, you see that the first row has erythromycin alone. And I can see that in the graph. There were 4 different people that had Staphylococcus aureus resistant to 1 drug, erythromycin. And all 4 of those people were on January 22nd. That's very unusual. The rest of the month, there were none. There were 4 on this day. There could be an outbreak on this day, a hospital outbreak or a community outbreak with 1 family. Or it could be a quality issue. Maybe there was some mistake in the laboratory. This was a brief introduction to the resistance profile analysis. In November 2023, we did have a 2-hour webinar on this topic titled WHONET and Multi-Drug Resistance. If you have an interest, you can see this video and download the materials. There is no requirement to listen to this webinar. It is not a part of the WHONET training course. This is only if you would like further information. Next slide. We now move on to microbiology alerts. You can see there are a few options for the report format: create dictionary, microbiology alert listing, microbiology alert summary. And there is also an option that we will discuss later. So in the listing, one row is one isolate, and you will see a list of isolates that satisfy at least one of the alert rules. As we discussed earlier, rules can be categorized as important species, important resistance, or quality control. They can also be categorized as high priority, medium priority, or low priority. This is followed by a summary, and you will see the number of isolates with each kind of alert. If you have many laboratories, there will be one column for each laboratory. There's also an option called Backtrack Dictionary, and WHONET creates a dictionary file with historical data that can be utilized in data entry to provide immediate feedback to the user on any new data that the user is entering. Here we see an example of the listing of microbiology alerts. You saw the same example earlier, except earlier some of the isolates had alerts and some of the isolates did not have alerts. In this analysis, every isolate here has some kind of alert. And if I scroll over to the right, then you would see the explanation for the red boxes. When I ran the analysis the first time, there were 622 isolates, but now there are only 121. So these are the isolates that have some kind of alert. This is now a summary of the alerts. For example, I see the row labeled 52, Neisseria meningitidis. There were 2 isolates, and this is an important species. If I look at the first row, labeled rule number 4, there were 31 isolates that were carbapenem non-susceptible. That's an important resistance. And you also see some examples of a quality control alert. For example, in row 121, an example of a discordant result might be ampicillin susceptible, but amoxicillin clavulanic acid resistant. That does not make biological sense. If a strain is resistant to amoxicillin clavulanic acid, it should also be resistant to ampicillin and amoxicillin. This is an example with backtrack and data entry. After I enter data for a laboratory, I can put that the isolate is a Staphylococcus aureus, resistant to several drugs, as you can see here. And then in the graph, it will show me the previous history of similar Staphylococcus aureus in the previous time period. This allows me to see how common the new pattern is compared to the historical isolates. And this might suggest, for example, a possible outbreak if it seems to be slowly growing. So what is the benefit of microbiology alerts? From the epidemiological perspective, one purpose of the analysis is to notify relevant staff of results of special clinical or public health importance, such as important species and important resistance. This is useful during data entry to provide immediate notification of alerts in real time, and the alerts can also be provided during data analysis for purposes of weekly or monthly summaries. From a quality perspective, another benefit are quality control alerts that may suggest errors such as typing errors or incorrect species identification or incorrect antibiotic results. These can be provided on a weekly or monthly basis, and it can be separated by laboratory. So in a national network, you can see which laboratories have which quality issues. As mentioned, there are some options, and here you can see the options available to you. WHONET typically shows you high priority alerts and medium priority alerts, but WHONET does not usually show you low priority alerts because they are more educational. But you can turn them on if you would like to see them. WHONET is also showing you all of the alert types: quality control, important species, important resistance, but you don't have to do that. You might want to run one report on important species and important resistance and give that to the infection control team. And you may want to run a different report for quality control and give that to the laboratory staff so that they can double check the results. Next slide. Finally, we will move on to the cluster alerts for the detection of possible outbreaks. We see there are 3 output formats: the daily signals, the signal summary, and the isolate listing. The daily signals are valuable for potential clusters that are growing over time. For example, maybe a true outbreak has 3 people on Monday and an alert, and then 5 people on Friday and another alert, and then 10 people the following week. So with the daily signals, there will be one row for each day where there is statistical significance. So you can see the evolution and the development of a possible outbreak. In the signal summary, you do have the same information, but it simply gets summarized into one row. That one row will have the date of the first signal, the date of the last signal, the number of patients with the first alert, and the total number of patients in the possible outbreak. Finally, you can also see an isolate listing, and that will give you all of the details about the person and the date and the location, the specimen type, and the antibiotic results. So what are the purposes of the cluster alerts? From an epidemiological perspective, the primary use of this feature is to find statistically significant increases in cases that might suggest disease outbreaks in the community or hospital setting. And early notification, investigation, and confirmation are key factors for early interventions to understanding and containing outbreaks. There's also a quality aspect. There are additional factors that can lead to statistically significant increases in cases. For example, contamination of samples or deficiencies in laboratory reagents. For example, if you have poor quality imipenem discs, you might have an outbreak of false resistance. These are not disease issues, but they are quality issues, and they should be investigated and corrected. There are other causes of statistically significant increases, such as changes in patient populations or changes in sampling practices, or change in laboratory test practices. Again, we have the options to choose stratification variables in the upper right. In the middle, we can choose to have the listing with the measurements, the MIC values, or the interpretations. And on the left, you see the options for cluster detection. In today's course, we won't talk about these in detail, but you can choose the analysis method, the dates for cluster detection, some of the statistical parameters, such as p-value threshold. For location, you can indicate latitude and longitude if that information is available, or groups of locations, such as all intensive care units, all pediatric units. So there is a lot of flexibility in how you design your analysis. This is an important and complicated and valuable area of work. We did hold two webinars on this topic in January and March 2024 called WHONET and Cluster Outbreak Detection. There's no requirement to listen to those webinars. They are not a part of the WHONET training course, but if you do have interest, you can look at these further. You can find further publications about our work with WHONET and SATScan by doing a PubMed search for WHONET and SATScan. So thank you for watching module number 5. Next up is module 6 about quick analysis reports. Thank you for your time.